and it's a limitation of how Mediator works. We are going to try to improve on this in the next lesson, but for now I want you to at least be aware of this limitation. Another remark I want to make is that we are marking the domain event as processed even when we run into an exception. I'm doing this mainly out of convenience and because I want to make this implementation simple, but in a real-world scenario, what you want to do here is to retry publishing this message a few more times, and if you still fail to successfully process the outbox message after a given number of retries, then you could mark it as processed and write down what the error was while processing that outbox message, or you can even move it to some dead letter queue for outbox messages and try to solve the problem manually if there is some sort of bug. Typically, there are two reasons why a publish would fail, either because some downstream dependency inside of the respective handler is unavailable, so you run into a transient failure, or because you have some sort of bug in the system that is stopping the domain event handler from completing successfully. So now that we have our process outbox message job in place, let's see how to configure it with Quartz. I'm going to introduce another class into the Outbox folder called Configure Process Outbox Job. It's implementing the iConfigure options interface of the Quartz options type. And I'm doing this because I can use the Quartz options instance to call a few helper methods that are going to help me configure my background job with Quartz. I will call add job and then specify the process outbox job as a generic argument. Then I need to give this job an identity, and I'm just going to use the fully qualified name containing the namespace for this job. I'm using the full name because I will be duplicating this across my modules, so I also want to include the name of the module in the identifier of the job. And then I'm going to configure the trigger for my background job, and I'm going to run it with some simple schedule using an interval in seconds, and this is going to be specified by the interval in seconds property on the outbox options instance. I'm also going to say that we should repeat this job forever because I want my outbox processor to execute continuously in the background. The next thing we need to do is to configure these options objects inside of the users module, and I'm going to say configure and then specify the outbox options, and I'm going to take these values from the user section for the respective module, and then the outbox section inside of the user section will contain the actual values. I'm also going to say configure options and specify my iConfigure options implementation, and this is going to trigger my configure method when it resolves the Quartz options type from dependency injection. The next thing we need is to define the respective configuration values inside of the settings file for the respective module. So let's head over to modules users JSON, and I'm going to introduce an outbox section. Let's say that the interval in seconds is 5 and the batch size is 50. And these are going to be the values in modules users JSON. Let's specify a different set of values in our development JSON file, and let's say that the batch size is 20 and that the interval in seconds is 15 seconds because I don't want to execute this job too often inside of my development environment. Now that we have everything in place, let's start the application and test out the implementation of the outbox pattern. Let's go ahead and send a post request from Postman to our API to register a new user. This is going to run the register user command handler that's going to raise a respective domain event that we want to store inside of the outbox. So let's hit send and examine what's going to happen. You can see that we hit the breakpoint inside of our command handler, and we can go ahead and create a new user in Keycloak. Then I'm going to persist this user in the database by calling save changes async. Now this is going to cause me to land on the breakpoint inside of the insert outbox messages interceptor, and if I hit continue, we're going to run our method that's going to collect the outbox messages. You can see that we have only one, which is going to be our user registered domain event, and we are going to add this to the change tracker. And if I continue with the execution, you will see that we are going to persist this as part of the current database transaction while also storing the user. So here you can see that we have an insert into the users table, as well as an insert into user roles, and most importantly, an insert into the outbox messages table. This is going to store our domain event as a JSON message in the content column, and I'm going to hit continue, and let's see if we're going to land in the process outbox job. As you can see, we hit the breakpoint in the process outbox job, and I strategically placed the breakpoint inside of the for each loop, and here you can see the outbox message that we have read from the database, and the content of our outbox message contains our domain event serialized as a string. Now watch what is going to happen, because I want to show you something that you could run into, and the fix for this is relatively simple. Now you can see that the deserializeObject method failed, and we ran into an exception. And it says something like could not create an instance of the type iDomainEvent because it's an interface or abstract class. Let's go ahead and stop our execution for a moment, and let's move into the database to check out what we have inside. If we take a look at the Outbox messages table in the user schema, we can see the one Outbox message that we have, and the content of our message contains the properties of the user registered domain event. The problem that we ran into was that the first field was the identifier instead of the type, which Newtonsoft.json uses to determine what is the type that we are trying to deserialize. So how are we going to fix this problem? I'm going to update the serializer settings instance, and all we have to do is set the metadata property handling property to the value of metadata property handling read ahead. We are running into this problem because we are using JSONB in Postgres to persist the content of our domain event serialized as a JSON document. And JSONB doesn't guarantee the order in which the properties are going to appear inside of the database. So we have to use read ahead to tell Newtonsoft.json to first find what is the type that we are trying to deserialize, and only then deserialize that into an object. Now I'm going to start my application again, and we are going to hit the same breakpoint because we didn't process our Outbox message. As you can see, we hit our breakpoint, and now if I try to deserialize the domain event, you will see that we get back the user registered domain event instance as we were expecting previously, but we first had to make an update to our JSON serializer settings. Now I'm going to resolve a publisher, and I'm going to publish my domain event, which is going to land inside of the user registered domain event handler. Here I'm going to send a query to fetch the user's details, and once we have that, we can go ahead and publish the user registered integration event. Now I'm going to hit continue at this step, and you can see that we land back inside of our process Outbox job. So let's go ahead and update the Outbox message and set that it was processed, and finally we can commit our database transaction and complete one run of the process Outbox job. And this is how we can implement the Outbox pattern inside of one module. The next step is going to be duplicating this implementation in the other modules, which means introducing the Outbox messages table in the respective database of each module, or rather the respective schema, and also adding an implementation of the process Outbox job while making sure that we are querying from the correct schema and also updating the Outbox message in the correct schema. I'm going to make this update in the background, and you will be able to download the latest version of the source code at the start of the next lesson. So in this lesson, we learned how to implement the Outbox pattern using EF Core interceptors to persist our domain events as Outbox messages, and then we added a simple background job to process our Outbox messages using Quartz. In the next lesson, I'm going to discuss how to introduce idempotency for our Outbox message handlers, or to be more precise, the domain event handlers. And you will see that this is a very interesting problem to solve.